Captain Hyunwoo stared at the massive screens that covered the walls of Lunar Research Station Omega-7 and felt his coffee grow cold in his hands as he watched something that should not exist. The signal came from deep space, far beyond any known human colony or exploration zone, and it carried with it the unmistakable mark of alien intelligence. After 300 years of searching the stars and finding nothing but empty worlds and silent void, humanity had finally received proof that they were not alone in the universe. Soo-jin sat at her communications console with her fingers dancing across holographic controls as she tried to make sense of the transmission. Her dark eyes reflected the blue glow of the displays as she worked to decode the alien message. She had been the best communications officer in the solar fleet before, accepting this assignment, and now she faced the most important translation work in human history. The signal used mathematical concepts and physical constants as a foundation, building up to more complex ideas in a way that suggested the aliens understood how to communicate with species they had never met before. Dongmin paced back and forth behind the tactical analysis station, his mind racing as he tried to understand the strategic implications of what they were receiving. He had spent 15 years studying alien contact protocols and theoretical xeno-war scenarios, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this moment. The transmission was not a peaceful greeting or a scientific exchange of information. It was something far more dangerous and unprecedented in all of human experience. Nari worked at the xenobiology station, her hands shaking slightly as she processed the biological data embedded within the alien message. The transmission included detailed scans of various alien species, their anatomical structures, their technological capabilities, and their final moments before extinction. She had dreamed of studying alien life since she was a child, but these images showed her something that filled her with horror rather than wonder. The aliens in the transmission were all dead, and the message made it clear that something had killed them all. The alien transmission identified itself as coming from the Keth Empire, a civilization that claimed dominion over vast regions of the galaxy. The message was a formal challenge broadcast to all spacefaring species within a 1,000 light-year radius. The Keth declared themselves to be the ultimate predators of the cosmos, the apex civilization that had conquered and destroyed over 400 different species across 12 galactic sectors. They offered a simple proposition to any species brave enough or foolish enough to respond: prove your worth in single combat, or face complete annihilation. Hyunwoo read the translated message again and again, hoping that somehow the meaning would change or that Soo-jin had made an error in the translation. The Keth challenge was accompanied by holographic records of their previous victories, and each recording showed the same pattern. A species would accept the challenge or be discovered by Keth scouts. A champion would be chosen from each side. The combat would take place in a designated neutral zone. The Keth champion would emerge victorious. The losing species would be systematically exterminated, their worlds stripped of resources, their technology absorbed into the Keth Empire, and their very existence erased from galactic history. Soo-jin turned away from her console with tears in her eyes as she finished processing the final segments of the transmission. The records showed species that had mastered technologies beyond human understanding falling before Keth champions. The Vorthak had developed genetic manipulation techniques that allowed them to reshape matter at the molecular level. Yet their champion lasted less than 10 minutes against the Keth warrior. The Zephyrian collective possessed psychic abilities that could influence minds across interstellar distances, but their mental powers proved useless against Keth biotechnology. Species after species had believed they possessed advantages that would guarantee victory, and species after species had been proven wrong in the most final way possible. Dongmin stopped pacing and turned to face his colleagues with a grim expression on his weathered face. He had run preliminary tactical analyses of the combat records, and the results terrified him more than any enemy he had faced during his military career. The Keth champions were not simply strong or technologically advanced. They were perfect killing machines that adapted to every opponent they faced. Each combat began with the Keth warrior analyzing their opponent's capabilities, identifying weaknesses, and then exploiting those weaknesses with ruthless efficiency. No species had ever found a way to surprise them or overcome their tactical superiority. Nari pulled up detailed biological scans of the Keth themselves, and what she found challenged every assumption about evolutionary development that human science had established. The Keth appeared to be a hybrid of organic and technological components, with their bodies modified and enhanced over countless generations of warfare. Their champions were not born but created, selected from the strongest Keth individuals, and then subjected to biotechnological enhancement that pushed them far beyond the limits of their original species. They were living weapons designed for a single purpose: the complete destruction of any opposition to Keth dominance. The four humans sat in silence for long minutes as they contemplated the implications of what they had discovered. Humanity had always wondered what would happen when they finally encountered alien intelligence, and now they had their answer. The galaxy was ruled by a species that viewed other civilizations not as potential allies or trading partners, but as obstacles to be removed or resources to be harvested. The Keth had spent millennia perfecting the art of xenocide, and they had apparently never encountered a species capable of stopping them. Hyunwoo knew that protocol required him to immediately transmit this information to Earth Command and let the politicians and generals decide how humanity should respond. The logical choice was obvious: maintain radio silence, avoid detection by Keth scouts, and hope that humanity could remain hidden until they developed better defensive capabilities. Contact with the Keth Empire would likely result in the extinction of the human species, and no rational leader would choose such a course of action. But as Hyunwoo looked at the faces of his team and thought about the 400 dead civilizations whose final moments were preserved in the Keth transmission, he felt something that had nothing to do with logic or rational decision-making. The Keth message was designed to intimidate potential opponents into submission, to make them understand that resistance was futile and that cooperation with Keth dominance was the only way to survive. The problem was that intimidation tactics had never worked particularly well on humans, especially when those humans were backed into a corner with no apparent way out. Su Jin was the first to speak, her voice quiet but steady as she looked at the transmission controls. She pointed out that the Keth challenge was still active, broadcasting across multiple star systems as it searched for species willing to face their champions. The transmission included detailed instructions for accepting the challenge, including coordinates for the designated combat zone and protocols for selecting champions from each species. All it would take was a simple response transmission to formally accept the Keth offer and commit humanity to single combat with the galaxy's most successful predator species. Dongmin argued against any form of response, pointing out that humanity had no realistic chance of victory against opponents who had defeated species far more advanced than Earth's current technological level. He calculated odds and ran simulations on his tactical computers, and every scenario ended with human extinction. The smart choice was to maintain silence and hope that the Keth would never discover humanity's existence in the vast emptiness of space. Nari disagreed with Dongmin's assessment, arguing that hiding was not a viable long-term strategy. The UY Keth transmission made it clear that they were expanding their territory and systematically exploring new regions of the galaxy. Eventually, they would discover human colonies and settlements, and when that happened, humanity would face the same choice that every other species had faced. The only difference would be that humanity would be caught unprepared, without time to develop new technologies or strategies that might give them an advantage. Hyunwoo listened to his team debate the options and felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. As captain of Lunar Research Station Omega-7, he had the authority to respond to the alien transmission without waiting for approval from Earth Command. It was a decision that could determine the fate of humanity, and he had to make it based on incomplete information and uncertain odds. He thought about the billions of humans living on Earth and the millions more scattered across the colonies, all of them unaware that their continued existence might depend on what happened in the next few minutes. The captain walked to the main communications console and placed his hand on the transmission controls. He looked one more time at the holographic records of the Keth's previous victories, and at the 400 extinct civilizations that had failed to meet their challenge. Then he began composing humanity's response to the most dangerous message ever received from the stars, knowing that his next words would either save his species or doom them all to extinct. President Ji-hoon stood at the head of the emergency council table in the Global Defense Command Center beneath Geneva, his face pale as he listened to the recording of humanity's response to the Keth challenge for the third time. The transmission had been sent from Lunar Research Station Omega-7 without authorization from Earth Command, and now there was no way to take it back. Captain Hyunwoo had committed the entire human species to single combat against the galaxy's most successful predator civilization, and Earth's leaders had less than 6 months to prepare for what would likely be humanity's final battle. Admiral Tae-hyun slammed his fist on the table and declared that they should immediately begin evacuation procedures for all major population centers. His military experience told him that facing the Keth in direct combat was suicide, and the only logical response was to scatter humanity across as many hidden colonies as possible. If their champion failed and Earth was destroyed, at least some humans might survive in distant star systems where the Keth would never find them. It was a coward's strategy, but it was better than complete extinction. Military strategist Yan Su disagreed with the Admiral's assessment, arguing that running away would only delay the inevitable. She had spent the last 72 hours analyzing every piece of data from the Keth transmission, and her conclusions were both terrifying and illuminating. The Keth Empire was systematically expanding across the galaxy, mapping every star system and cataloging every form of life they encountered. Even if humanity tried to hide, they would eventually be discovered and forced to face Keth champions under less favorable circumstances. The time to fight was now, while they still had some element of surprise. The debate raged for hours as Earth's leaders tried to find a solution to an impossible problem. Some argued for attempting diplomatic contact with the Keth, hoping to negotiate a peaceful resolution or at least delay the combat long enough to develop better defensive technologies. Others suggested ignoring the challenge entirely and hoping that the Keth would move on to other targets. But the alien transmission had made their intentions clear. Any species that received their challenge had already been marked for conquest, and there was no escape from what was coming. Dr. Jae-sung entered the council chamber carrying a thick folder of research reports and technical specifications. As Earth's leading expert on advanced weapons technology, he had been working around the clock with teams of scientists and engineers to develop new tools that might give humanity's champion a fighting chance. His preliminary findings offered a glimmer of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. Recent breakthroughs in quantum field manipulation and energy storage systems had produced prototypes that surpassed anything in humanity's current arsenal, though they remained largely untested in actual combat situations. The scientist's assistant, So Young, accompanied him into the chamber and immediately began setting up holographic displays that showed the technical specifications of their new developments. Her breakthrough in personal energy shielding technology was particularly promising, as it offered protection against the kind of energy weapons that Keth champions typically employed. The shields were powered by miniaturized fusion reactors that could operate continuously for weeks without refueling, and they could be configured to absorb and redirect incoming energy attacks rather than simply deflecting them. President Ji-hoon called for order as the discussion turned to the selection of humanity's champion. The choice would determine not only the outcome of the combat, but the survival of the entire species, and it required careful consideration of every available candidate. The Global Defense Council had identified several potential champions from various military branches, each with different strengths and specializations that might prove useful against Keth opponents. The decision would ultimately rest with the president, but he wanted input from every expert in the room. General Min Ho emerged as the leading candidate after extensive evaluation of his combat record and psychological profile. He had served with distinction in the Martian colonial wars, where his tactical innovations had turned certain defeat into unexpected victory on multiple occasions. More importantly, he had undergone the experimental genetic enhancement program that pushed human physical and mental capabilities to their theoretical limits. His reflexes were faster than any unenhanced human. His strength exceeded Olympic records by significant margins, and his capacity for tactical analysis in high-stress situations was unmatched by anyone in the solar fleet. Master Hyejin was assigned to oversee Min Ho's combat training, bringing together ancient martial arts techniques with modern military tactics in a way that had never been attempted before. She had spent 30 years studying combat forms from every human culture, seeking to understand the fundamental principles that made warriors effective across different contexts and technological levels. Her approach emphasized adaptability and improvisation rather than rigid adherence to established patterns, recognizing that the Keth champion would likely use tactics that no human had ever encountered. The training facility constructed for Minho's preparation was unlike anything that had ever existed on Earth. It combined traditional martial arts dojos with advanced virtual reality combat simulators, allowing him to practice against holographic recreations of the Keth champions shown in the alien transmission. The simulations were imperfect because they were based on limited data, but they gave Minho the opportunity to develop strategies and techniques that might work against opponents who possessed superior strength and advanced biotechnology. So Young worked directly with Minho to integrate her energy shielding technology into his combat armor, creating a defensive system that was both highly effective and remarkably lightweight. The shields could be configured for different types of threats, from concentrated energy beams to physical projectiles, and they included feedback systems that allowed the wearer to redirect absorbed energy back toward attackers. The technology was revolutionary, but it remained untested against the specific types of weapons that Keth champions employed. Dr. Jae Sung presented his team's analysis of the combat records from previous Keth challenges, identifying patterns and weaknesses that might be exploited by a sufficiently creative opponent. The Keth champions relied heavily on overwhelming their opponents through superior firepower and intimidation tactics, but they showed less adaptability when faced with unconventional strategies or unexpected responses. Every species that had challenged them had fought according to their own traditional combat doctrines, making it relatively easy for the Keth to predict and counter their moves. Yansu developed a comprehensive tactical plan that emphasized humanity's strengths while minimizing exposure to Keth advantages. Human warriors had always excelled at improvisation and adaptation, traits that had allowed them to survive and thrive in hostile environments throughout their evolutionary history. Rather than trying to match the Keth champion's raw power, Minho would focus on unpredictability and creative problem-solving, using the combat environment itself as a weapon when necessary. The months of preparation passed quickly as teams of specialists worked to give humanity's champion every possible advantage. New weapons were designed and tested, incorporating technologies that pushed the boundaries of human scientific understanding. Combat simulations became increasingly sophisticated as more data was gathered about Keth tactics and capabilities. Minho's training regimen was expanded to include scenarios that had never been considered in traditional military doctrine, preparing him for a type of warfare that no human had ever experienced. President Ji-hoon visited the training facility regularly, watching Minho practice against holographic Keth opponents and discussing strategy with the team of experts who surrounded him. The weight of responsibility was evident on the president's face as he contemplated the consequences of failure. If Minho was defeated, Earth would face systematic destruction at the hands of an enemy that had never shown mercy to conquered species. Billions of lives depended on the performance of a single warrior in a combat scenario that defied all conventional military wisdom. Admiral Tae-hyun continued to advocate for evacuation procedures even as the training program progressed, arguing that Earth's population should be dispersed to increase the chances of human survival regardless of the combat outcome. Secret colony ships were prepared and loaded with essential personnel and equipment, ready to depart for distant star systems if the worst came to pass. The ships would carry humanity's scientific and cultural legacy to hidden worlds where it might survive even if Earth fell to Keth forces. Nari arrived from the lunar station with additional intelligence gathered from deep space monitoring systems. The Keth had acknowledged humanity's acceptance of their challenge and transmitted coordinates for the designated combat zone, along with specific rules and protocols that would govern the engagement. The combat would take place in a neutral, asteroid field, with representatives from both species present to witness the outcome and ensure compliance with established procedures. As the designated combat date approached, Minho's training reached its final phase. The asteroid field designated as the combat zone stretched across millions of cubic kilometers of empty space, filled with chunks of rock and metal that had been drifting in the void for countless millennia. Minho sat in the cockpit of humanity's most advanced stealth fighter as pilot, Wu Jin guided their craft through the treacherous navigation path toward the designated meeting point. The ship was a masterpiece of human engineering, incorporating every technological breakthrough that Earth's scientists had achieved during the months of preparation, but it looked like a child's toy compared to the massive vessel that waited for them in the center of the asteroid field. The Keth ship was unlike anything in human experience, a biomechanical hybrid that seemed to grow rather than being constructed according to traditional engineering principles. Its hull pulsed with organic rhythms that suggested living tissue, while technological components protruded from its surface like metallic growths. The vessel was easily 10 times larger than anything in humanity's space fleet, and sensor readings indicated power outputs that exceeded the total energy production of Earth's largest cities. It was a statement of technological superiority that made humanity's position in the coming combat seem even more hopeless. Wu Jin had been selected as Minho's pilot because of his exceptional skills in zero-gravity navigation and his ability to remain calm under extreme pressure. He had flown missions in the asteroid belts of the outer solar system, where a single navigation error could mean death among the spinning rocks and unpredictable gravitational fields. Now he faced the most important flight of his career, carrying humanity's champion to a confrontation that would determine the fate of his entire species. The Keth champion emerged from the alien vessel in a display that was clearly designed to intimidate any potential opponents. Krexvoth stood nearly 3 meters tall, its body a fusion of organic muscle and technological enhancement that defied human understanding of biological limitations. Its arms ended in hands that could transform into various weapon configurations, while its torso was covered in armor plating that appeared to be grown rather than manufactured. Most disturbing of all were its eyes, which glowed with an inner light that suggested intelligence far beyond anything humanity had encountered. Minho watched the Keth champion through his ship's viewports and felt no fear despite the obvious physical disadvantage he faced. His months of training and genetic enhancement had prepared him for this moment, and he understood that intimidation was just another weapon in the Keth arsenal. The key to victory lay not in matching his opponent's raw power, but in finding ways to use humanity's unique strengths against an enemy that had never faced anything like human adaptability and creativity. The combat zone itself was a sphere 50 kilometers in diameter, marked by energy beacons that would prevent either combatant from leaving the designated area. The asteroids within the zone ranged from small pebbles to massive chunks of rock several kilometers across, creating a three-dimensional maze that would test both warriors' ability to navigate and fight in zero gravity. The environment had been chosen to be neutral, giving neither species a significant advantage based on their natural habitat or preferred combat conditions. Before the actual combat could begin, both civilizations were required to present their combat philosophy and demonstrate their warrior traditions. This ritual served multiple purposes, allowing each species to assess their opponent's capabilities, while also providing psychological preparation for the violence that would follow. The Keth went first, as befitted their status as the challenge, issuers and the dominant military force in this region of the galaxy. Krexvoth's demonstration was a masterpiece of calculated terror that had broken the morale of countless opponents before combat even began. The Keth champion activated holographic projectors that filled the combat zone with images of previous victories, showing in graphic detail how earlier challengers had been dismantled by Keth weapons and tactics. The recordings were accompanied by audio transmissions of defeated enemies begging for mercy that never came, their final words preserved as trophies in the Keth cultural database. The alien warrior explained the Keth philosophy of combat in terms that left no room for misunderstanding. They viewed warfare as the ultimate test of species fitness, with victory going to those who possess superior strength, technology, and tactical thinking. Mercy was weakness that led to eventual defeat, while compromise represented a failure. To commit fully to the warrior path, the Keth had conquered 400 species because they understood that the universe belonged to those willing to take it by force. Minho listened to the Keth presentation with growing understanding of why so many civilizations had fallen before these opponents. The psychological warfare was expertly crafted to destroy hope and create despair, making victory seem impossible even before the first weapon was fired. Species after species had entered combat already convinced of their own defeat, fighting not to win, but simply to die with honor. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy that had served the Keth well across centuries of galactic conquest. When Minho's turn came to present humanity's combat philosophy, he chose an approach that surprised everyone watching the encounter. Instead of displaying human weapons or military achievements, he activated his own holographic projectors and began showing recordings of human history that emphasized very different themes. The images showed humans surviving ice ages through cooperation and innovation, rebuilding cities destroyed by natural disasters, and continuing to fight wars even when defeat seemed certain. The human champion explained that humanity's greatest strength had never been superior firepower or advanced technology, but rather their ability to adapt to changing circumstances and find creative solutions to impossible problems. He showed recordings of human soldiers using improvised weapons and unconventional tactics to defeat enemies with superior equipment. He displayed examples of human communities surviving in hostile environments by working together and sharing resources rather than fighting over them. Most importantly, Minho included recordings that showed humans helping their enemies rather than destroying them completely. He showed field hospitals where human medics treated wounded soldiers from both sides of various conflicts, peace treaties that transformed bitter enemies into trading partners, and reconstruction efforts that rebuilt defeated nations rather than leaving them in ruins. It was a combat philosophy based on the idea that true victory came not from destroying opponents but from creating conditions where former enemies could become allies. The Keth champion responded to this presentation with what could only be described as confusion mixed with contempt. Krexvoth had studied the combat records of hundreds of species, but none had ever presented mercy and cooperation as military virtues. From the Keth perspective, these human traits represented fatal weaknesses that would be easily exploited in actual combat. Any species that helped their enemies was demonstrating unfitness for survival in a universe governed by constant warfare. Wu Jin monitored communications channels as representatives from both civilizations exchanged final messages before combat began. The Keth transmissions were filled with confidence bordering on arrogance as they had never encountered a species capable of defeating their champions. The human communications were more subdued, but they carried undertones of determination that suggested Minho and his support team were not yet ready to concede defeat. The formal combat protocols were activated as both warriors took their positions at opposite ends of the designated zone. Minho secured himself in his combat armor while running final system checks on his weapons and defensive equipment. The energy shields developed by So Young hummed to life around him, creating a protective barrier that could theoretically withstand the kind of energy weapons that Keth champions typically employed. His weapons were a mixture of conventional firearms and experimental energy projectors that incorporated the latest advances in human military technology. Krexvoth positioned itself near a large asteroid that would provide cover during the opening phases of combat, its biomechanical systems cycling through various weapon configurations as it prepared for battle. The alien warrior had never lost a single combat in over 200 challenges, and it showed no signs of concern about facing yet another inferior species. From the Keth perspective, this would be just another routine extermination of a species that had overestimated its own capabilities. The final countdown began as automated systems verified that both combatants were ready and all safety protocols were in place. Representatives from both civilizations confirmed their champions' readiness to begin lethal combat under the established rules. Minho took a deep breath and focused his mind on the training he had received and the tactics he had developed specifically for this encounter. He understood that the next few hours would determine not only his own fate, but the survival of every human being in the universe. As the countdown reached 0 and the combat officially began, Minho activated his thruster systems and began moving through the asteroid field with the fluid grace of a dancer. His approach was immediately different from that of previous Keth opponents. Krexvoth launched the opening attack with weapons that had never failed to overwhelm previous opponents in the first few minutes of combat. Energy beams capable of cutting through starship hulls lanced across the asteroid field, turning chunks of rock into clouds of superheated vapor as they sought their human target. The Keth champion had learned through centuries of experience That early intimidation and overwhelming firepower typically ended combats before opponents could develop effective countermeasures. Minho did not try to absorb or deflect the incoming energy beams as previous challengers had attempted. Instead, he used the asteroid field itself as protection, weaving between the floating rocks with precision that would have been impossible for an unenhanced human pilot. His thruster systems allowed him to change direction instantly, making his flight path unpredictable even to opponents with advanced targeting systems. When energy beams struck the asteroids he had been using for cover, he was already moving toward different positions. The human champion's evasive maneuvers forced Krexvoth to modify its attack patterns in ways that no previous opponent had required. The Keth warrior was accustomed to enemies who fought according to predictable doctrines, making tactical adjustments unnecessary after the initial engagement. But Minho seemed to be learning and adapting in real time, using each exchange to gather information about his opponent's capabilities while revealing as little as possible about his own tactical approach. Hana monitored the combat from Earth's command center, watching sensor readings that showed the battle developing in ways that defied all previous Keth combat records. The engagement had already lasted longer than any of the alien victories documented in their transmission, and Minho showed no signs of the panic or desperation that had characterized earlier challenges. Instead, the human champion appeared to be conducting a systematic analysis of his opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Minho began his counterattack by doing something that violated every principle of conventional military doctrine. Instead of targeting Krexvoth directly, he began systematically destroying his own equipment in carefully calculated ways. He overloaded thruster systems to create explosive charges, modified weapon power supplies to generate electromagnetic pulses, and even used his own armor plating as improvised projectiles. Each act of self-sabotage was designed to create new tools and weapons from the wreckage of existing systems. Krexvoth watched these actions with complete bewilderment, as no opponent in Keth history had ever deliberately damaged their own equipment during combat. The alien warriors' tactical analysis systems were not programmed to process this type of behavior, leading to hesitation and confusion at critical moments. For the first time in its existence, the Keth champion faced an opponent whose actions could not be predicted by established combat algorithms. The human champion used his opponent's confusion to launch attacks from unexpected directions, appearing behind asteroids that Krexvoth had dismissed as tactically irrelevant. Minho had turned the three-dimensional battlefield into a maze where the normal rules of engagement no longer applied, creating opportunities for surprise attacks that exploited gaps in Keth defensive systems. His improvised weapons proved surprisingly effective against an opponent designed to counter conventional military technology. As the combat continued, Minho began employing psychological warfare techniques that were completely outside Keth experience. He started talking to Krexvoth during brief lulls in the fighting, asking questions about previous Keth victories and commenting on the alien warrior's fighting style. These conversations were casual and almost friendly, as if Minho were discussing the weather rather than fighting for the survival of his species. The human champion asked Krexvoth about specific opponents from the combat records, wondering what had made certain species particularly challenging or interesting. He complimented the Keth warriors' technique and equipment, pointing out tactical innovations that demonstrated superior strategic thinking. Most disturbing of all, from the Keth perspective, Minho seemed genuinely curious about Keth culture and philosophy rather than being consumed with hatred or fear. Krexvoth found these conversational interludes deeply unsettling because they violated every assumption about how combat should proceed. Previous opponents had either maintained grim silence or screamed in rage and desperation, both of which were emotional responses that the Keth understood and could exploit. But Minho's friendly curiosity suggested a mental state that was completely outside the normal parameters of lethal combat. The tide of battle began to shift when Minho deliberately allowed himself to be caught in what appeared to be a devastating tactical error. He positioned himself in an area where Krexvoth could bring multiple weapon systems to bear simultaneously, creating an opportunity for the Keth champion to demonstrate the overwhelming firepower that had destroyed so many previous opponents. The alien warrior launched a coordinated attack that should have ended the combat in humanity's defeat. But Minho had anticipated this exact scenario and used it to his advantage in a way that defied Keth understanding. As Krexvoth's weapons converged on his position, the human champion activated systems that turned his apparent vulnerability into a trap. The energy absorption capabilities of his armor redirected the incoming attacks back toward their source, while hidden weapon systems that had been positioned throughout the battlefield activated simultaneously. Krexvoth suddenly found itself under attack from multiple directions by weapons that had been created from the wreckage of human equipment scattered throughout the combat zone. Minho had been using his earlier acts of apparent self-sabotage to position improvised devices that could be activated remotely when the tactical situation required. The Keth champion's moment of apparent victory became a desperate struggle for survival against an opponent who had turned the entire battlefield into a weapon. The human champion pressed his advantage by doing something that no Keth opponent had ever attempted. Instead of trying to destroy Krexvoth outright, Minho began targeting specific systems and components that would disable rather than kill his opponent. His attacks were surgically precise, designed to eliminate the Keth warrior's offensive capabilities while leaving life support and basic mobility intact. It was a tactical approach that prioritized victory over vengeance. Krexvoth's confusion deepened as it realized that the human was deliberately avoiding lethal attacks, even when such strikes would have been tactically advantageous. This pattern was so far outside normal combat parameters that the Keth warrior could not process it effectively. Every instinct and training program indicated that opponents should be eliminated as quickly and thoroughly as possible, yet Minho seemed to be following completely different rules. The Keth champion attempted to exploit what it perceived as human weakness by launching desperate attacks that risked its own destruction in exchange for the possibility of taking Minho down as well. These suicide tactics had worked against opponents who were unprepared for such extreme measures, but the human champion responded by doing something that shattered Krexvoth's worldview completely. When the Keth warrior's biomechanical systems began failing due to battle damage and the stress of operating beyond safe parameters, Minho abandoned his winning tactical position to provide emergency assistance. The human champion used his medical supplies and technical knowledge to stabilize Krexvoth's failing life support systems, working to save the life of an opponent who had been trying to kill him moments before. Krexvoth lay dying despite Minho's efforts, its biomechanical systems shutting down one by one as damage accumulated beyond the point of field repair. The Keth warrior had never experienced anything like the current situation, where an enemy was risking his own safety to provide aid during combat. Everything the Keth had learned about warfare suggested that such behavior was impossible. Yet, it was happening before the aliens' failing sensors. The Keth champion managed to ask a single question before its communication systems failed completely, using the last of its energy reserves to transmit a query that no Keth had ever needed to voice before. Krexvoth wanted to understand why Minho had chosen to help rather than to complete his victory. Why a human would save an enemy that had come to destroy his entire species. Minho's response became the most important transmission in galactic history, words that would be remembered and repeated across countless star systems in the years to come. The human champion explained that true strength was not measured by the ability to destroy opponents, but by the wisdom to recognize when destruction was unnecessary. He told the dying Keth warrior that the strongest civilizations in the universe were those that could turn enemies into friends rather than simply eliminating all opposition. The human champion continued his explanation even as Krexvoth's systems failed beyond recovery, speaking to an opponent who might no longer be able to hear his words. Minho described humanity's belief that the galaxy was large enough for many different species to coexist and thrive, and that competition did not require the complete elimination of competitors. He suggested that the Keth Empire's greatest victory might come not from conquering another species but from learning to see. The silence that followed Minho's final transmission stretched across the combat zone and beyond, reaching the watching fleets of both civilizations as they struggled to process what had just occurred. No combat in Keth history had ever ended, with a warrior attempting to save his opponent's life, and no challenge had ever concluded with an offer of continued dialogue rather than the complete destruction of the losing species. The representatives of the Keth Empire found themselves facing a philosophical crisis that threatened the very foundations of their civilization. Emperor Thek-Mor observed the combat from his flagship positioned at the edge of the asteroid field, surrounded by his advisors and military commanders, as they tried to understand the implications of their champion's defeat. For over 1,000 years, the Keth had built their empire on the principle that superior strength was the only measure of species fitness and that mercy toward enemies was a weakness that led inevitably to destruction. Yet they had just witnessed a human warrior achieve victory through exactly the kind of compassionate behavior that Keth doctrine declared to be impossible. The Emperor's chief strategist, Vex Thrawn, argued that the human victory was meaningless because it had been achieved through trickery and deception rather than honest combat. According to this interpretation, Minho had violated the spirit of the challenge by refusing to fight according to established protocols, making his victory invalid under traditional Keth law. The proper response would be to ignore the combat results and proceed with the systematic destruction of humanity as originally planned. But other members of the Keth Leadership Council disagreed with Vex Thrawn's assessment, pointing out that their own combat records showed numerous examples of Keth champions using unconventional tactics when necessary. The challenge rules had never specified that opponents must fight according to Keth preferences, and Minho had operated entirely within the established parameters. More importantly, his victory had been achieved through superior tactical thinking, rather than cheating or rule violations. Admiral Keth Vor raised the most disturbing question of all, asking whether the humans' demonstration of mercy might actually represent a form of strength that the Keth had never encountered before. The Admiral pointed out that every species they had conquered had fought desperately to destroy Keth champions, suggesting that hatred and fear were natural responses to their empire's expansion. But Minho had shown neither emotion, instead, displaying a confidence that suggested humanity possessed resources and capabilities that the Keth had not anticipated. Emperor Thek-Mor dismissed his advisors and spent long hours alone, reviewing the combat recordings and trying to understand what the human victory meant for his empire's future. The Keth had spent centuries building their identity around the concept of species hierarchy, determined by combat prowess. But Minho's actions suggested that this hierarchy might be based on incomplete understanding of what constituted true strength. On Earth, President Ji-hoon waited in the Global Defense Command Center for news of the combat outcome, surrounded by military leaders and scientists who had spent months preparing for humanity's greatest challenge. The initial reports from the combat zone were confusing and contradictory, with observers struggling to explain how Minho had achieved victory against an opponent that should have been unbeatable. Only when complete recordings became available did Earth's leaders begin to understand what their champion had accomplished. Dr. Jae Sung analyzed the technical aspects of the combat, marveling at Minho's ability to improvise weapons and tactics from materials that had been considered expendable. The human champion had demonstrated creativity and adaptability that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of his enhancement program. More importantly, his victory had been achieved without requiring technological breakthroughs that were beyond human capabilities, suggesting that similar tactics might work against other opponents. Master Hyejin studied the psychological dimensions of the combat, recognizing elements of ancient warrior philosophies that she had incorporated into Minho's training program. The human champion had combined physical techniques with mental disciplines that emphasized understanding opponents rather than simply defeating them. His conversations with Krexvoth during the battle had served multiple purposes, gathering tactical intelligence while also establishing human psychological superiority. Yeonsu focused on the strategic implications of Minho's victory, recognizing that the combat had established humanity as a significant force in galactic politics, rather than simply another species to be conquered or ignored. The manner of the victory was as important as the outcome itself, as it demonstrated human capabilities that would influence how other civilizations responded to future contacts. Humanity had announced its presence on the galactic stage in a way that commanded respect rather than fear. 3 days after the combat ended, Emperor Thek-Mor transmitted a message to Earth that stunned everyone who received it. the Keth leader announced that his empire was prepared to begin negotiations with humanity regarding the establishment of diplomatic relations and possible alliance agreements. The message included formal recognition of Minho's victory and acknowledgement that humanity had demonstrated fitness for survival according to Keth standards. But the Emperor's message also included revelations that changed everyone's understanding of the galactic situation. Thekmor explained that the Keth challenge system was not simply a method of conquest and expansion, but part of a larger testing program that had been operating for millennia. The true purpose of Keth activities was to identify species that possessed the qualities necessary for membership in a galactic community that existed beyond the knowledge of most civilizations. The Emperor revealed that an ancient species called the Gardeners had established the testing system after achieving a level of technological and philosophical development that made them nearly godlike compared to younger civilizations. The Gardeners had withdrawn from direct contact with emerging species, instead creating proxy civilizations like the Keth to evaluate new candidates for galactic citizenship. Species that failed the tests were eliminated, while those that succeeded were invited to join a community of advanced civilizations working together on projects that spanned entire star clusters. Thekmor explained that the Keth themselves had been subjected to similar testing in their distant past, when they had been evaluated by a different proxy species and found worthy of advancement. Their role as destroyers and conquerors was a necessary function in the galactic ecosystem, preventing the emergence of civilizations that would threaten the stability of more advanced communities. But their testing methods had evolved over time, and humanity's response had revealed flaws in their current approach. The human demonstration of mercy toward a defeated enemy had shown the Gardeners that their testing system was eliminating species that might have valuable contributions to make to galactic civilization. Minho's actions suggested that compassion and cooperation might be more important survival traits than pure combat effectiveness, leading to a fundamental reevaluation of the criteria used to judge species fitness. Emperor Thekmor announced that the Keth Empire would begin transitioning from its role as destroyer of unworthy species to a new function as mentor and guide for civilizations that showed promise for eventual advancement. Humanity would be the first species to benefit from this new approach, with Keth teachers and advisors helping to accelerate human technological and social development. The Emperor's message concluded with an invitation for human representatives to visit the Keth homeworld and begin the process of integration into the galactic community. The journey would take months even with Keth transportation technology, but it would mark the beginning of humanity's participation in projects and relationships that spanned multiple star systems and included species with capabilities that bordered on the miraculous. President Ji-hoon accepted the Keth invitation while also beginning preparations for humanity's new role in galactic affairs. The challenge that had threatened to result in human extinction had instead opened doors to opportunities that no one had imagined possible. Earth's scientists and diplomats began studying Keth technology and culture in preparation for contacts with civilizations that were even more advanced and alien. Minho returned to Earth as humanity's greatest hero, but he remained humble about his accomplishments and focused on the future rather than past glories. The human champion understood that his victory had been just the first step in a much longer journey, and that humanity would face many more challenges as they learned to navigate the complex politics and relationships of galactic civilization. 6 months later, Captain Hyunwoo stood in the observation deck of humanity's first embassy to the Keth Commonwealth, watching as former enemies worked together on projects that would have been impossible for either species to accomplish alone. The galaxy's most feared predators had become unexpected allies and teachers, demonstrating that even the most fundamental assumptions about interspecies relationships could be overturned by the right combination of courage, wisdom, and compassion.